about the Legal Entity Identifier. So I flew in this morning from Geneva, Switzerland, and you'll be happy to know that the weather there is much worse. It's actually very nice here in London. It's been raining about since the time the clocks changed, so now you get to the end of every day, and not only is it dark and dreary, but you're wet from the top to the bottom. So it was quite nice to be here to walk easily in the weather here from the hotel here. And maybe, James, I just asked you, there we go.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll start off tonight with giving you just a little bit of background on what is the Global LEI Foundation, the LEI, and then I'll go into some of our digital projects that we are piloting right now, and then a bit more focus on LEI adoption and addressing exactly the question that James just posed. So to start with, for those of you that are not aware of the LEI and the GLIFE, we are a foundation, a Swiss foundation, based out of Basel, Switzerland. We actually have our operations in Frankfurt. Me, myself, I am based in Geneva, and we have a few other individuals in Europe as well as the United States. The system itself is a three-tier system. We have at the top what is called an LEI Regulatory Oversight Committee that consists of 71 regulators from around the world as well as several observers. And actually, Asia, who is joining our panel, is one of the members of that LEI ROC. We also have a board of independent directors, 18 coming from around the world. Here's a few statistics associated with the foundation. I will just focus on the left-hand side there. So I mentioned we have three levels or three tiers in the system. The LEI ROC, us, the foundation, that are managing the operational and technical standards. And then we have our third level being what is referred to as LEI issuers or LOUs. So these are the organizations that are practically having the relationship with the legal entity. They are responsible for issuing and keeping LEIs up to date. They are accredited by the foundation, by LIFE. It is quite a rigorous program, about 9 months to complete. And we have 33 of them located around the world. There is not a monopoly on a jurisdiction, so these organizations are accredited by jurisdiction. They have to demonstrate they know what makes a legal entity, how to validate authorized signatory, these type of activities for each jurisdiction in which they offer services. As of the end of third quarter 2019, we have 1.5 million LEIs issued, and that covers over 200 jurisdictions in the world. The Legal Entity Identifier itself, it's quite simple and straightforward. It's a 20-digit alphanumeric code. It is an ISO standard, ISO 17442, and it connects to some key reference data answering two questions: who is who and who owns who? And that is quite important for the idea of our second part of the presentation, that being the digital strategy and digital implementation of the LEI. The three characteristics that are the most important with the LEI is that it is global, it is persistent, it's a lifelong experience for a company, and it's open data. So all of the legal entity identifiers and the associated reference data that is collected, it is gathered each day by the foundation, and it is published to the foundation's website. It is accessible in XML files, but also by API. And that is really a core principle of the system, that the regulators that put in place this structure were very strong, that the system must be based on open and free data for the public user. To date, the global LEI system and the number of LEIs issued have grown largely through regulatory mandate. So we have more than 100 rules that are associated with different countries that participate in the Financial Stability Board. Our starting point was in the OTC derivatives space. And there you will have OTC derivative markets almost universally covered. We still have a little more work to do in Asia, but we do have already both Japan and South Korea that have made some recent announcements. And then you see, of course, the usage expanding to securities markets, debt, etc. Most notably here in Europe with the Markets and Financial Instrument Directive. That is where the LEI towards end of 2017, beginning 2018 had really its quite spectacular growth. now that it is a requirement for all counterparties and transacting parties in European financial markets to have the LEI. So what was the LEI originally envisioned for? I'll go back to those three characteristics: a global identifier, persistent over the life of the company, and based on open data. So we at Glyph in early 2018, we conducted a study to really understand, well, what does entity identification look like today? We surveyed large, medium, and small banking organizations in UK, Germany, and also United States. And what we found was that on average, these organizations used 4 identifiers when onboarding new legal entity clients. That led to some concerns coming from the respondents on the accuracy of the data, because now you're getting different identifiers with their reference data set and having to reconcile why are there differences. At the bottom corner there, you'll see some of the negative impact of these different identifiers. So indeed, there's inconsistent information, which is ultimately a drain on resources. So somebody has to be dealing with this. And often what it comes down to is manual work looking into these differences. Lack of transparency and reliance on proprietary data. So oftentimes the reference data that's associated with these identifiers, they are required for fee paying, et cetera. We've got to maintain that. So it's a very, very complex situation for institutions to deal with. When the LEI system was first being envisioned, the original discussions and perhaps the vision was to replace. So to take out that complexity by replacing and putting an LEI, a legal entity identifier, in as that primary key. But what we have found in our discussions with private sector, with regulators, replacing is a very, very scary word. And so since about 2004, 2014, 2015, what we have evolved to is rather to focus on mapping. So rather than ripping out what some consider the heart of an operating system and trying to put in a new key, we tried to make links between the LEI to other systems. We introduced something we call a certification of LEI mapping program. So this allows data vendors or organizations that have important identifiers to demonstrate to us how do they conduct a mapping, and then we together publish an open file of the 2 identifiers. So to date we have the big code, which is maintained by Swift. We have an open and public big to LEI mapping, and then we recently published an open and public LEI to ISIN mapping. So that is a little bit different concept, because one is legal entity to legal entity, and the other is a legal entity to the security. But it is what we like to demonstrate there is the importance of using that LEI to move between information. So really being that Esperanto of linking together different and disparate sources. Just to give you an example of how deep that idea of replacing can really run, we were engaging in discussions with one government agency that was really looking into using the LEI exclusively, and we continue dialogues on this project. And so they really had some difficulties, really fundamental with their existing identity system. So it had been in place for years, and now they were at a situation where companies had multiple identifiers. They had been shared across companies, and their primary key was almost unusable. So they had put together really quite a nice roadmap of what it would mean to and how to transition to the LEI. And so we were sitting in these discussions and we said, well, how long, this is great, this is amazing, all the work you've done, and how long will it take to get this done? And any guesses approximately how long it would take to replace one primary key with another?
3 years.
That's very optimistic. 15 years. So we recognize that indeed the LEI is not the only identifier that's out there, but what it can play is that role of being a global identifier. Even within the LEI reference data, you already see the linkage. So for example, here in UK, you would have for UK-based entities a reference within the reference data to the company's house as the local registration authority where you can find that entity. and then also the local number. So if you wanted to get more information on what is that legal entity, you could easily trace back to the originating source, and you could easily investigate further. So even within the record, you have that idea of the LEI almost as a passport, and then a link down to a local, let's say, driver's license, etc., or citizen card. So I'll move here into a discussion of digital applications. So I'm sure all of you have heard quite regularly news articles, conferences about digitization and how that will change workflows, processes, and if you think about it from a personal perspective, already, just in 5 years' time, digitization has, I'm sure, changed the way that you operate on a day-to-day basis. You think about how you shop, how you watch movies. I was just in the United States, and one of my friends was showing me he now has a video camera attached to his house because he gets a reduction from his insurance company if he can prove that he's been monitoring and watching all the activity around his house. And so you think of all these new and different ways that digitization has impacted us. And then if you take it back one step and you say, well, how many different accounts and identities am I managing? I have accounts for shopping, I have accounts for hotel reservations, for renting books at the library. And just curious, if you reflect on that, how many identities do you think you have? Maybe 10?
Not the rest.
At the end of the day, it comes down to you probably have maybe even hundreds. So if you think about that from an organizational perspective, this also impacts entities. And what does that mean? That means, let us say, a corporate account. You could have a corporate account with Amazon, and maybe you have a corporate account also with Apple. Well, those two identities, they don't talk to each other, they don't know each other. And we think that here, from the Glyph perspective, that is one of the major issues that companies will face as they are going through digitization. So you see at the bottom there, two concerns or questions that we started asking ourselves probably about 2 years ago. And that is, are we going to see multiple digital IDs emerging, kind of as you do now, where there's almost an aspect of customer lock-in or customer leveraging that privilege situation once you have that identity established? And then additionally, what will be the management platform? So how to manage this proliferation of IDs. So the first area where we started a bit more collaboration and research was looking into digital certificates. So digital certificates, whether issued by governments or private sector, are a means to enable authentication and authorization. They are used to secure content in some cases. They can also be used to secure a website. The one problem, though, with digital certificates is that they do not do a good job of identifying who is associated with that certificate. So we thought this was a great opportunity to demonstrate a pilot project of embedding an LEI in a digital certificate to answer the 3 questions that you want to be able to answer in a digital transaction. That is identity verification, authentication, and authorization. So you'll see here a snapshot of our 2018 annual report. With this report, it's innovative in 2 aspects. We collaborated with XBRL and completed the report production in inline XBRL formatting. So that means it's both an XBRL format, but also it's HTML rendable. So that means it's something that is easy for machines to consume, but also very pretty for the human eye to look at. And that prevents that you have to now produce 2 documents, one that is XBRL machine readable, the other that is a nice glossy PDF that's posted to your website. Additionally, in the XBRL filing, we use the LEI to identify our firm. Now, for the Glyph, a small Swiss foundation, okay, it's a little interesting. With that LEI, you can, in a machine-readable fashion, connect to the open data. You get a little bit more information on the basic business card, etc. But if you think and you extrapolate that to a large corporate structure, so what if in a large corporate structure you had an LEI for all of the related entities, for significant suppliers, and all of that was embedded in a machine-readable fashion in the annual report? Well, you could, in a completely easy, non-human interference fashion, download that information, and you could paint a picture of who am I doing business with and who is that organization doing business with. So very powerful from the XBRL standpoint. Now, we took that one step further, and we also signed the annual report with a digital certificate with an LEI embedded. That means if that digital report was, or sorry, if that annual report was delivered to you all via an email, or you picked it off of a website server that was not the foundation's website server, you could take a look at that certificate and you could validate that it is indeed coming from the GLIFE and it's a representation of the GLIFE's annual account. That certificate, the certificates that were applied included the board, the chairman board, the GLIFE CEO, as well as our third-party external auditor. Now, to make the connection to the XBRL filing, the LEI is embedded in the certificate. So it's that one additional step of verifying that indeed this financial statement is associated with this company and it is signed by a certificate of someone that has a certain role, CEO or director of that company. So that is a demonstration of what we call an offline solution. So this is a static document that can be delivered, that can be reviewed, but we also wanted to look a little bit into online identity management. So today, how is identity management for online type of transactions generally managed? Usually there is a centralized server, and that is used to store account information, etc. This area, however, is being highly impacted by distributed ledger technology because there is a vision to move away from centralized stores. These have concerns about privacy issues. There's lack of personal control. And one emerging theme is digital verifiable credentials. Digital verifiable credentials are interoperable, cryptographically verified, and are running on distributed ledger technology. They enable real-time access to services or applications. And so we started exploring the idea of combining the digital verifiable credential with the LEI. And why is that so important? Well, I bring back that three main characteristics: global, persistent, and open data. So creating a bridge between the credential to the real-world identity of the legal entity. We wanted to explore one particular use case. And that use case was a legal entity submitting a regulatory filing to authorities. So we worked with two different partner organizations that were developing, or that are developing, applications for digital verifiable credentials. One of them is using the Ethereum blockchain, the other Hyperledger Indy. And we said, well, let's see if we can come up with two proofs of concept, one of them more based on a European regulator, the other with a United States regulator, but to demonstrate what could this look like. So in one case, we worked with Banque de France, INSEE, and also an organization called Uport. That is our Ethereum-based proof of concept. And in the other, we worked with several US regulators, Bloomberg as the LEI issuer, and then Evernym running off of the Hyperledger Indy. So here I will just paint the scene for what this use case looks like. So you have the legal entity, but of course a legal entity doesn't do a filing. You have a person acting on behalf of that legal entity that will do the filing. You then have our different actors there on the left-hand side, or I suppose for you the right-hand side of the screen. You have the foundation, you have an LEI issuer, and then a regulator that is willing to accept these credentials. So to start off with, you have a legal entity that goes through the normal process of getting an LEI. So it contacts its LEI issuer, it provides the required documentation. And that LEI issuer will go through the process of validating and issuing the LEI. What is unique in this case is that it would also issue a digital verifiable credential at the same time. Once the legal entity has that credential, it can then manage its own organization and essentially create an organizational wallet by giving to individuals in its organization a digital verifiable credential. So in this case, we have two individuals. We have Sandra Signer, who is responsible to sign the regulatory filing, and we have Ann Submitter. So she is the one that practically logs into the portal and puts forward this filing. Just an important note that I'll come back to, all of this information is still gathered and published in the Global LEI Index. So what do these digital verifiable credentials look like? You have the legal entity digital verifiable credential. It would have the LEI in there to act as a bridge to the open data. You would also have additional attributes as required by the regulator. And then you have the two credentials issued to the individual. And the important thing to note there is the role. So here we're starting to standardize roles. And from our experience and our interactions with the regulators, they have expectations on what are the roles of individuals that will be signing and will be submitting certain documents. We now went through the process of signing, having Sandra sign that document with her digital verifiable credential, and then logging into the portal, submitting that document, and the regulator accepting it. And now comes the very important part, and where you really see the power of these digital verifiable credentials. You have a trust chain that has been created that the regulator can verify. So if we start at the very top, we have the regulatory filing, and there's 3 digital verifiable credentials applied. First, for the individuals, so the signer and the submitter to confirm that they are indeed the appropriate roles associated with the legal entity. Then you have the legal entity digital verifiable credential. So you're confirming indeed this is the entity I'm expecting to receive a filing from, and here's digital proof they are indeed valid. Next, you have that LOU or the LEI issuer, so you know the digital credential came from a valid source. And lastly, you would also have GLIFE's digital verifiable credential. So you know that the LEI came from an organization that was accredited and went through the process with GLIFE. So from a regulator perspective, they can really go through all the checkboxes and know this is a valid filing. From the linking back to that topic of open data, so this here is a screenshot of what normally LEI reference data looks like on our website, but highlighted in the green box. It's a little bit difficult to read, but it would be a new aspect, and what this is a request for verification. So certainly we would not be collecting personal data, that is not open and public data, but what would be collected and published would be the role. So as a recipient of the LEI information, you would know that there is a CEO role and there is a submitter role that is associated with this legal entity. You could also submit a request for that verification. You could get back, for example, a QR code or something, but all on the open public website to validate the credentials that have been presented with you. You could also extend this to other areas. I won't go too much into this, but I'll just do a quick summary here. So with both examples, with the digital certificate as well as the digital verifiable credentials, we see one area where we have more of our offline transactions securing content, and another area online transactions. And what we like to highlight here is the importance of using that persistent and global identifier, being the LEI, to make these applications interoperable and also to allow choice of moving back and forth between different applications. And I'll close out here by going a bit into adoption. So I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation that currently today there are about 1.5 million LEIs that have been issued. Everywhere we go, when we talk about the LEI, we describe the concept of it, we always hear positive feedback. Oh, this is, of course, this is really what we've been looking for. And then comes the question, well, how many are there out there? You say about 1.5 million, and people say, well, there's actually about hundreds of millions of companies that exist, so what are we going to do with this system if there's only 1.5 million? So what we have been doing in 2019, in addition to working on some of the applications, is looking into the business model of the global LEI system and how we can move forward with adoption. To date, we have our LEI Regulatory Oversight Committee, which has done really an excellent job of growing the LEI system through regulatory mandate, but now is the time we want to engage further with the private sector. So we engaged with McKinsey about the middle of the year to conduct a set of interviews and surveys, yes, within our home turf, that being finance, but also going out into digital economy and supply chain management. what we heard there coming from the interviews was the top pain point across all sectors is the manual linking of entity data. So we feel there's a very, very strong value proposition to use the LEI across many different sectors. Now, that being said, when there's discussions going more into digital economies, supply chain management, the LEI is simply not known. And so again, nice concept, interesting, but not really something that's tangible and real. However, when we got into more of the finance and especially banking industry, there you see the LEI has already gained huge traction. And this is a lot due to the push with MiFID II, where truly you need to have that LEI for engaging in any of your financial markets here in Europe. So that led us to the conclusion or the McKinsey suggestion that what we should really be focusing on is growing the LEI within the banking industry. And there's two reasons for that. One is, as I just mentioned, the LEI is well known and already has a strong foundation. But the second is, if you look at the natural cycle of customer lifecycle management, that is where you see the greatest cost savings from an industry perspective. So you'll see the LEI touches all aspects of your customer lifecycle management, starting with that initial onboarding and then regular refresh, then going into transaction and the associated reporting, and of course from risk monitoring, so being able to aggregate data, understand positions, etc. McKinsey conducted a review of, well, how much does it cost the industry today in the customer lifecycle management, and through their reviews of different surveys, identified about $40 billion US expended annually to conduct customer onboarding. Of that 40 million, they estimate there could be a 5 to 10% reduction, so 2 to 4 billion, just by using the LEI in the customer onboarding. So you think to yourself, well, what is really driving that cost savings? And it comes down to eliminating a lot of the manual reconciliation. So half of that cost savings is coming from reducing the duplicative data flows, and the other half is coming from enabling straight-through processing. So kind of bringing back to the beginning of the opening, thinking about the LEI as that identifier that can be a bridge and truly live up to that global initiative. So with that, I think I will bring my presentation to a close, and I will turn over then to our distinguished panelists for further reaction.
Thank you very much, James. I was looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you this evening, and James took me to one side on the way in and said, Hugh, Claire is the main speaker this evening. Be brief and interesting, and if you have to compromise on interesting. I also noticed that Claire was being incredibly good at not drinking before she gave her speech. I always drink before I give my speech because it increases the number of people who find me witty and entertaining from 0 to 1. So identity is a fraught area, as those of you who have a train journey to read the outstanding publication that you can find on the desk downstairs, happily signed if you wish. It's not easy to deal with, and it's not easy to deal with at every level. My father, who worked at English Electric in Brough, which is now part of BAE Systems, in the 1960s when they made the Lightning fighter jet, for those of you who are of similar vintage, you'll remember essentially it was an engine with small bits at the side to try and stop it ploughing into the ground. And they were manufacturing them, and they had manufactured and delivered Lightning, and one that threw 64 to the RAF, and they were sitting on the apron was Lightning 66, and nobody could find Lightning 65. Indeed, they searched the premises, they checked the RAF hadn't received it, and they then formed a 6-man team to trace the manufacture of Lightning 65 through the manufacturing process. And this team had been working for half a year, diligently going through all the records, where somebody actually went and looked at the Lightning sitting on the apron to discover it was Lightning 65 with 66 painted on the tail fin. So identity is always a challenge. I think in the world of entity identification, if I might say so with the greatest respect, I see my role in many of these things as being the grain of sand that hopefully produces the pearl. However, most people just find me irritating. But with a relatively recently formed organisation dealing with this, the history of what entities do is not something you've had yet to profoundly to deal with. So what happens in joint ventures? What happens when organisations break up? How do you trace a many-to-many relationship between identifiers? I think will be something that undoubtedly you will solve over time. There was the mention on one slide of trust. Now, trust is not a sort of relationship happy-clappy thing. Trust is a who the heck have I got recourse against if somebody turns out to be operating with malfeasance. So suppose not every LOU employee is entirely honest, and suppose somebody crosses their palm with silver or takes their family hostage and says thou shalt issue LEIs to the following fraudulent companies, and other organisations then rely on those, to whom is the recourse and to what extent? Because actually the legal embodiment of trust is the single biggest issue to getting any form of acceptance and reliance of one organisation on another organisation's identification and confirmation that an entity is what it is. And given that cock-up and conspiracy are the two classic enemies of smooth functioning organisations and systems, what vulnerabilities does this process have in terms of cock-up and conspiracy? Transposition of digits when things are first issued, that then subsequently are untransposed and therefore don't reconcile. Overall, when we look at individual identity, as you will see in the outstanding publication on the desk downstairs, for individual identity, the best practice is typically to identify somebody. It's something you are, something you have, and something you know. And when you see the plethora of multi-factor authentication, whose prime function is to annoy, prime purpose is to increase alleged security, one can see that that gets implemented. That becomes much more difficult when you are looking at entities because, as Claire pointed out, you have to have people exercising roles. And I'm sorry to say, I can just imagine that the submitter's credentials are on the sticky on the side of their PC on their desk, and that when the chief executive is travelling, her PA is asked to sign and submit the regulatory returns on her behalf. I don't have difficulty in foreseeing that. Of course, nothing is perfect in this world, and what LIFE is doing is genuinely fantastic because it deals with a huge issue that we must address if we're going to move forward. The reason I am bearish is because of issues around trust and the recourse that comes through trust. The fact that clearly the system works when the good and well-intentioned operate efficiently, but how robust will any system be to people who choose to operate with ill intent, and how will life's cock-ups be dealt with? No doubt these will be all ironed out in the course of how the system going forward. So I have been the grain of sand. I'm sure Claire's found me irritating, probably the rest of you have, but maybe there's a pearl there somewhere, I can only hope. Thank you very much indeed.
I guess I'll cover this at a slightly different angle, or maybe from a more commercial angle. So a little bit of history. I used to work for Deutsche Bank, and I was an authorised signatory at Deutsche Bank. And once a quarter, somebody would come up to my desk. I only realised this after it happened a couple of times. It's like, didn't you come here like quite recently, over 3 months ago? Shuffling bits of paper. It's like, you're an authorised signatory. We need to validate, just make sure that this is you, this is your role, this is what your permission to sign off on behalf of the entity, and we have a sample signature. So I was inquisitive. It's like, well, hold on, you've got like hundreds of people. There's hundreds of people who are responsible, authorised to take action on behalf of this legal entity. Now, Deutsche Bank's got like hundreds of legal entities, and you've got hundreds of people who are authorised to do stuff on behalf of that entity. So I asked the question, how long does it take to put all this together? It's like, well, there's a whole team of us, you're all in different places, it's really difficult to organise. It takes about 6 weeks, a whole bunch of us, and then when we actually get it, we put it together in a PDF and then we email it to like 1,500 counterparts. So this is really important information. So you've got these individuals who are acting on behalf of this entity who are approved to do all sorts of transactions, whether it's payments, sign off legal documents. But the thing is, it's like, right, okay, so you do this once a quarter, you email it out to everyone, all the counterparts. This is like a part of the process that I think that you were explaining. By the time they've actually sent this out, then some of the people who were on this authorised signatory list have already left the organisation. So basically, you're trying to maintain a list of authorised personnel. The process is so inefficient that actually what you're doing is providing an authorised signatory list which is actually out of date and exposing the organisation to fraud. This is just a little backstory as to what we're doing at the moment. So I'm a founder and CEO of Signatize. We've got a really unsexy application based on very sexy technology. So we have, quite simply, a decentralised blockchain database for maintaining and distributing authorised signatory lists. And we've been going for some time now. We don't have 1.5 million entities on board. We've got about 250 with circa 1,500 signatories. I guess we're just a little bit of a puzzle, maybe one layer down from the legal entity identifier. By default, we are actually sort of creating another bit of this identity. I think there's lots of different types of identity. I guess we are kind of creating a community of authorised signatories, which are dictated by lots of different entities, which then change and evolve, and like one company buys out another company, and then these signatories like kind of evolve. So we are coming at it from like a real commercial aspect, because our driver is literally just to make some cash. It's like we have a blockchain company, one of the very few that actually make money. We don't sell it as a blockchain application. We sell it as that we're actually solving a real problem, which every organisation, every financial organisation actually suffers from. So the pain point we're solving is we're replacing a manual process. All of this stuff is maintained on paper. Each company has like bank accounts, corporate bank accounts, where you've got like it could be a handful of people, it could be 2 people, it could be hundreds of people that can make payments. If you need to change the responsibility, you've got to submit to Barclays, to HSBC, to RBS, like sheets of paper to change this authority, which is frankly ridiculous. So anyway, we're on a quest to kind of get as many entities on board our private blockchain as possible. I guess like maybe we can do that by kind of joining forces with the companies like yourself who are trying to sort of standardise for different aspects. So that's our angle. Thanks very much.